Section 10 of An Editor's Tales by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Panjandrum, Part 1, Hope, continued. But from the first starting of the conception of the Panjandrum, I had had a great idea, and that idea was discussed at length on the evening of which I am speaking. We must have something that should be sparkling, clever, instructive, amusing, philosophical, remarkable, and new, all at the same time. That such a thing might be achieved in literature I felt convinced, and it must be the work of 3 or 4 together. It should be something that should force itself into notice, and compel attention. It should deal with the greatest questions of humanity, and deal with them wisely, but still should deal with them in a sportive spirit. Philosophy and humor might, I was sure, be combined. Social science might be taught with witty words, and abstract politics made as agreeable as a novel. There had been the Corn Law Rhymes and the Noctis. It was, however, essentially necessary that we should be new, and therefore I endeavored, vainly endeavored, to get those old things out of my head. Fraser's people had done a great stroke of business by calling their editor Mr. York. If I could get our people to call me Mr. Lancaster, something might come of it. But yet it was so needful that we should be new. The idea had been seething in my brain so constantly that I had hardly ate or slept free from it for the last 6 weeks. If I could roll Churchill Smith and Jack Hallam into one, throw in a dash of Walter Watt's fine political eagerness, make use of Regan's ready poetical facility, and then control it all by my own literary experience, the thing would be done. But it is so hard to blend the elements. I had spoken often of it to Pat, and he had assented. "I'll do anything into rhyme," he used to say, "if that's what you mean." It was not quite what I meant. One cannot always convey one's meaning to another, and this difficulty is so infinitely increased when one is not quite clear in one's own mind. And then Pat, who was the kindest fellow in the world, and who bore with the utmost patience a restless energy which must often have troubled him sorely, had not really his heart in it, as I had. "If Churchill Smith will send me ever so much of his stuff, I'll put it into Latin or English verse, just as you please, and I can't say more than that." It was a great offer to make, but it did not exactly reach the point at which I was aiming. I had spoken to Smith about it also. I knew that if we were to achieve success, we must do so in a great measure by the force of his intellectual energy. I was not seeking pleasure, but success, and was willing, therefore, to endure the probable discourtesy, or at least want of cordiality, which I might encounter from the man. I must acknowledge that he listened to me with a rapt attention. Attention so rapt is more sometimes than one desires. Could he have helped me with a word or two, now and again, I should have felt myself to be more comfortable with him. I am inclined to think that 2 men get on better together in discussing a subject when they each speak a little at random. It creates a confidence, and enables a man to go on to the end. Churchill Smith heard me without a word, and then remarked that he had been too slow quite to catch my idea. Would I explain it again? I did explain it again, though no doubt I was flustered and blundered. "Certainly," said Churchill Smith, "if we can all be witty and all wise, and all witty and wise at the same time, and all together, it will be very fine. But then, you see, I'm never witty, and seldom wise." The man was so uncongenial that there was no getting anything from him. I did not dare to suggest to him that he should submit the prose exposition of his ideas to the metrical talent of our friend Regan. As soon as we were assembled, I rose upon my legs, saying that I proposed to make a few preliminary observations. It certainly was the case that at this moment Mrs. St. Quintin was rinsing the teapot, and Mary Jane had not as yet brought in the muffins. We all know that when men meet together for special dinners, the speeches are not commenced till the meal is over. And I would have kept my seat till Jack had done his worst with the delicacies, had it not been our practice to discuss our business with our plates and cups and saucers still before us. "You can't drink your tea on your legs," said Jack Hallam. "I have no such intention," said I. "What I have to lay before you will not take a minute." A suggestion, however, came from another quarter that I should not be so formal, and Mrs. St. Quintin, touching my sleeve, whispered to me a precaution against speech making. I sat down and remarked in a manner that I felt to be ludicrously inefficient that I had been going to propose that the magazine should be opened by a short introductory paper. As the reader knows, I had the introduction then in my pocket. "Let us dash into the middle of our work at once," said Walter Watt. "No one reads introductions," said Regan. My own friend, Pat Regan. "I own I don't think an introduction would do us any particular service," said Lydia, turning to me with that smile which was so often used to keep us in good humor. I can safely assert that it was never vainly used on me. I did not even bring the verses out of my pocket. And thus I escaped at least the tortures of that criticism to which I should have been subjected had I been allowed to read them to the company. "So be it," said I. "Let us then dash into the middle of our work at once. It is only necessary to have a point settled, then we can progress." After that I was silent for a while, thinking it well to keep myself in the background. But no one seemed to be ready for speech. Walter Watt fingered his manuscript uneasily, and Mrs. St. Quintin made some remark, not distinctly audible, as to the sheets on the sofa. "But I must get rid of the tray first," she said. Churchill Smith sat perfectly still with his roll in his pocket. "Mrs. St. Quintin and gentlemen," I said, "I am happy to tell you that I have had a contribution handed to me which will go far to grace our first number. Our friend Regan has done Lord Bateman into Latin verse with a Latinity and a rhyme so excellent that it will go far to make us at any rate equal to anything else in that line." Then I produced the translated ballad, and the little episode took place which I have already described. Mrs. St. Quintin insisted on understanding it in detail, and it was rejected. "Then upon my word I don't know what you are to get," said I. "Latin translations are not indispensable," said Walter Watt. "No doubt we can live without them," said Pat, with a fine good humor. He bore the disgrace of having his first contribution rejected with admirable patience. There was nothing he could not bear. To this day he bears being Attorney General at the Turtle Islands. Something must be done. "Perhaps," said I, turning to the lady, "Mrs. St. Quintin will begin by giving us her ideas as to our first number. She will tell us what she intends to do for us herself." She was still embarrassed by the tea things, and I acknowledge that I was led to appeal to her at that moment because it was so. If I could succeed in extracting ideas, they would be of infinitely more use to us than the reading of manuscript. To get the thing "licked into shape" must be our first object. As I had on this evening walked up to the sombre street leading into the new road in which Mrs. St. Quintin lived, I had declared to myself a dozen times that to get the thing "licked into shape" was the great desideratum. In my own imaginings I had licked it into some shape. I had suggested to myself my own little introductory poem as a commencement, and Pat Regan's Latin ballad as a pretty finish to the first number. Then there should be some 30 pages of dialogue, or trialogue, or hexalogue, if necessary, between the different members of our board, each giving, under an assumed name, his view of what a perfect magazine should be. This I intended to be the beginning of a conversational element which should be maintained in all subsequent numbers, and which would enable us, in that light and airy fashion which becomes a magazine, to discuss all subjects of politics, philosophy, manners, literature, social science, and even religion, if necessary, without inflicting on our readers the dullness of a long unbroken essay. I was very strong about these conversations, and saw my way to a great success if I could only get my friends to act in concert with me. Very much depended on the names to be chosen, and I had my doubts whether Watt and Churchill Smith would consent to this slightly theatrical arrangement. Mrs. St. Quintin had already given in her adhesion, but was doubting whether she would call herself Charlotte, partly after Charlotte Corday, and partly after the lady who cut bread and butter, or Mrs. Freeman, that name having, as she observed, been used before as a nom de plume, or Sophrony, after Madame de Sévigné, who was pleased so to call herself among the learned ladies of Madame de Rambouillet's bower. I was altogether in favour of Mrs. Freeman, which has the merit of simplicity, but that was a minor point. Jack Hallam had chosen his appellation. Somewhere in the Lowlands he had seen over a small shop door the name of John Never-a-Penny, and John Never-a-Penny he would be. I turned it over on my tongue a score of times, and thought that perhaps it might do. Pat wanted to call himself the Oblazes, but was at last persuaded to adopt the quieter name of Tipperary, in which county his family had been established since Ireland was settled, I think he said. For myself, I was indifferent. They might give me what title they pleased. I had had my own notion, but that had been rejected. They might call me Jones or Walker if they thought proper, but I was very much wedded to the idea, and I still think that, had it been stoutly carried out, the results would have been happy. I was the first to acknowledge that the plan was not new. There had been the Noctis, and some imitations even of the Noctis. But then, what is new? The Noctis themselves had been imitations from older works. If Socrates and Hippias had not conversed, neither probably would Mr. North and his friends. "You might as well tell me," said I, addressing my colleagues, "that we must invent a new language, find new forms of expression, print our ideas in an unknown type, and impress them on some strange paper. Let our thoughts be new," said I, "and then let us select for their manifestation the most convenient form with which experience provides us." But they didn't see it. Mrs. St. Quintin liked the romance of being Sophrony, and to Jack and Pat there was some fun in the nicknames, but in the real thing for which I was striving they had no actual faith. If I could only lick them into shape, I had said to myself at the last moment, as I was knocking at Mrs. St. Quintin's door. Mrs. St. Quintin was nearer, to my way of thinking, in this respect than the others, and therefore I appealed to her while the tea things were still before her, thinking that I might obtain from her a suggestion in favour of the conversations. The introductory poem and the Latin ballad were gone. For spilt milk, what wise man weeps? My verses had not even left my pocket. No one there knew that they had been written, and I was determined that not one should know. But my conversations might still live. Ah, if I could only blend the elements! "Sophrony," said I, taking courage, and speaking with a voice from which all sense of shame and fear of failure were intended to be banished. "Sophrony will tell us what she intends to do for us herself." I looked into my friend's face, and saw that she liked it. but she turned to her cousin, Churchill Smith, as though for approval, and met none. "We had better be in earnest," said Churchill Smith, without moving a muscle of his face, or giving the slightest return to the glance which had fallen upon him from his cousin. "No one can be more thoroughly in earnest than myself," I replied. "Let us have no calling of names," said Churchill Smith. "It is inappropriate, and especially so when a lady is concerned." "It has been done scores of times," I rejoined, "and that too in the very highest phases of civilization, and among the most discreet of matrons." "It seems to me to be twaddle," said Walter Watt. "To my taste it's abominably vulgar," said Churchill Smith. "It has answered very well in other magazines," said I. "That's just the reason we should avoid it," said Walter Watt. "I think the thing has been about worn out," said Pat Regan. I was now thrown upon my mettle. Rising again upon my legs, for the tea things had now been removed, I poured out my convictions, my hopes, my fears, my ambitions. If we were thus to disagree on every point, how should we ever blend the elements? If we could not forbear with one another, how could we hope to act together upon the age as one great force? If there was no agreement between us, how could we have the strength of union? Then I adverted, with all the eloquence of which I was master, to the great objects to be attained by these imaginary conversations. "That we may work together, each using his own words, that is my desire," I said, and I pointed out to them how willing I was to be the least among them in this contest, to content myself with simply acting as chorus, and pointing to the lessons of wisdom which would fall from out of their mouths. I must say that they listened to me on this occasion with great patience. Churchill Smith sat there with his great hollow eyes fixed upon me, and it seemed to me as he looked that even he was being persuaded. I threw myself into my words, and implored them to allow me on this occasion to put them on the road to success. When I had finished speaking, I looked around, and for a moment I thought they were convinced. There was just a whispered word between our Sophronie and her cousin, and then she turned to me and spoke. I was still standing, and I bent down over her to catch the sentence she should pronounce. "Give it up," she said. And I gave it up. With what a pang this was done few of my readers can probably understand. It had been my dream from my youth upwards. I was still young, no doubt, and looking back now I can see how insignificant were the aspirations which were then in question. But there is no period in a man's life in which it does not seem to him that his ambition is then, at that moment, culminating for him, till the time comes in which he begins to own to himself that his life is not fit for ambition. I had believed that I might be the means of doing something, and of doing it in this way. Very vague indeed had been my notions, most crude my ideas. I can see that now. What it was that my interlocutors were to say to each other I had never clearly known. But I had felt that in this way each might speak his own speech without confusion, and with delight to the reader. The elements, I had thought, might be so blent. Then there came that little whisper between Churchill Smith and our Sophronie, and I found that I had failed. "Give it up," she said. "Oh, of course," I said, as I sat down. "Only just settle what you mean to do." For some few minutes I hardly heard what matters were being discussed among them, and, indeed, during the remainder of the evening I took no real share in the conversation. I was too deeply wounded even to listen. I was resolute at first to abandon the whole affair. I had already managed to scrape together the sum of money which had been named as the share necessary for each of us to contribute towards the production of the first number, and that should be altogether at their disposal. As for editing a periodical in the management of which I was not allowed to have the slightest voice, that was manifestly out of the question. Nor could I contribute when every contribution which I had suggested was rejected before it was seen. My money I could give them, and that no doubt would be welcome. With these gloomy thoughts my mind was so full that I actually did not hear the words with which Walter Watt and Churchill Smith were discussing the papers proposed for the first number. There was nothing read that evening. No doubt it was visible to them all that I was, as it were, a blighted spirit among them. They could not but know how hard I had worked, how high had been my hopes, how keen was my disappointment, and they felt for me. Even Churchill Smith, as he shook hands with me at the door, spoke a word of encouragement. "Do not expect to do things too quickly," said he. "I don't expect to do anything," said I. "We may do something even yet," said he, "if we can be humble and patient and persevering. We may do something, though it be ever so little." I was humble enough, certainly, and knew that I had persevered. As for patience, well, I would endeavor even to be patient. But prior to that, Mrs. St. Quintin had explained to me the programme which had now been settled between the party. We were not to meet again till that day fortnight, and then each of us was to come provided with matter that would fill 21 printed pages of the magazine. This, with the title page, would comprise the whole first number. We might all do as we liked with our own pages, each within his allotted space, filling the whole with one essay or dividing it into 2 or 3 short papers. In this way there might be scope for Pat Regan's verse, or for any little badinage in which Jack Hallam might wish to express himself. And in order to facilitate our work, and for the sake of general accommodation, a page or 2 might be lent or borrowed. "Whatever anybody writes, then," I asked, "must be admitted?" Mrs. St. Quintin explained to me that this had not been their decision. The whole matter produced was, of course, to be read, each contributor's paper by the contributor himself, and it was to be printed and inserted in the first number, if any 3 would vote for its insertion. On this occasion the author, of course, would have no vote. The votes were to be handed in, written on slips of paper, so that there might be no priority in voting, so that no one should be required to express himself before or after his neighbor. It was very complex, but I made no objection. As I walked home alone, for I had no spirits to join Regan and Jack Hallam, who went in search of supper at the Haymarket, I turned over Smith's words in my mind, and resolved that I would be humble, patient, and persevering, so that something might be done, though it were, as he said, ever so little. I would struggle still. Though everything was to be managed in a manner adverse to my own ideas and wishes, I would still struggle. I would still hope that the Panjandrum might become a great fact in the literature of my country. End of the Panjandrum, Part 1, Hope. End of Section 10. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina.